July 25, 1944. 0950 hours. South of the ruined Norman town of St. Lo, in a command post dug beneath the roots of an apple orchard, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein heard the earth begin to shake. It did not begin with gunfire. It began with sound from the sky, a deep mechanical roaring that grew and grew until it seemed to press the air itself downward. Then the bombs fell and the ground lurched and the telephone lines went dead and the runners who went forward did not come back. When the American infantry crossed the line that morning and the reports finally reached him, Bayerlein did something unusual for a professional soldier of his rank and experience. He described exactly what had happened to his division without evasion, without political explanation, without blaming the weather or Hitler's interference or the cowardice of subordinates. He sat before American military historians in August 1945 and told them the truth. He said his men were dead. He said the ground looked like a moonscape. He said the Allied air-directed artillery had at times been worse than the bombers themselves. He said that over 70% of the soldiers in his forward positions had been killed, wounded, driven mad, or concussed beyond the ability to function. He said he had faced nothing like it in 4 years of war across 3 continents. This is the story of how American artillery broke the finest armored division Germany fielded in the West, and of the extraordinary admission that emerged from the wreckage. To understand why Bayerlein's words carry the weight they do, you must first understand what he was commanding. The Panzer Lehr division had not been assembled the way ordinary German divisions were assembled. It was not built from conscript drafts or territorial levies or the survivors of shattered formations. It was constructed deliberately in the winter of 1943 to 1944 from the instructors, demonstration soldiers, and veterans of Germany's own armored training schools, on the direct order of Heinz Guderian. Every man assigned to it had been selected for his record. Every vehicle was issued to Panzer Lehr before it went to any other unit. Its grenadiers had trained other men how to fight. Its tank crews had taught younger soldiers the basics of armored warfare. The division was, in the most literal sense possible, the assembled expertise of the German armored force. When it moved toward Normandy in June 1944, Panzer Lehr carried nearly 15,000 men, over 200 armored vehicles and artillery assets that any other German division in the West would have envied. British intelligence called it the most powerful armored division Germany had deployed in the West. By every measurable standard, that assessment was correct. Its commander matched the formation he led. Fritz Bayerlein had served in North Africa from 1941, rising to become Chief of Staff to Erwin Rommel himself. He had been present at enough pivotal engagements across 2 fronts that his professional judgment commanded respect across the officer corps. He was not given to dramatic language or self-serving exaggeration. When he described a battle, people believed him. This matters because what he described about July 25th would have strained credulity if any lesser witness had offered it. What destroyed his division that morning was not merely a weapon, it was a system, and that system had been built quietly, methodically, over a decade in the red clay hills of southwestern Oklahoma at the United States Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill. The problem Fort Sill was trying to solve in the 1930s was one that armies had accepted as permanent for generations. Every artillery battery could direct its own fire. What no army had been able to do quickly was mass the fires of multiple batteries onto a single target on short notice. To do that, each battery had to receive the target location, compute its own firing data independently, receive orders through a chain of command, and fire at some coordinated moment. The process took hours. By the time it was complete, a mobile target had moved or the tactical situation had changed. 2 officers at Fort Sill decided to attack this problem directly. Major Carlos Brewer as director of the gunnery department in the late 1920s and early 1930s, introduced battalion centralized fire direction techniques. In the spring of 1931, his department demonstrated massed battalion fire from a single computational node, and the result was decisive enough that the idea could not be ignored. Major Orlando Ward, who followed him, developed the concept into what became the formal Fire Direction Center. The idea was to create a single computational hub at battalion level. Every piece of relevant information would flow into that center. The observer's grid coordinates for the target, the atmospheric conditions, the temperature, the muzzle velocity of each gun, the precise location of every tube in the battalion. A team of specialists would process all of that data together and translate it into simultaneous firing commands for every gun in range. Those commands would go out by radio and telephone wire. The guns would fire at the computed instant, and all their rounds would arrive within seconds of each other. General Leslie McNair drove the Fire Direction Center into doctrine, into the unit tables of every artillery battalion being formed, and into the curriculum of every officer school in the country. By the time American divisions were training in 1942 and 1943, the Fire Direction Center was not a theoretical innovation. It was standard procedure. Every artillery officer was trained in it. Every battalion had the personnel and equipment to operate it. No other army in the world had built this capability above the battery level. Not Britain, not the Soviet Union, not France, and certainly not Germany. The tactical product this system created was called the time-on-target concentration. Each participating battalion computed its own time of flight to the target, worked backward from the coordinated moment of arrival, and fired at the precise instant required for its shells to land simultaneously with every other shell in the mission. The effect on the receiving end was that the first round and the 100th round arrived within approximately 3 seconds of each other. There was no opening salvo to announce what was coming, no ranging shot that a veteran soldier could identify as the signal to move. The fires simply appeared, all of them at once, with no interval for reaction. Veterans of the Eastern Front who faced this technique for the first time in Normandy had no reference point for it. They had experienced heavy fire. They had not experienced the specific combination of mass and simultaneity that the time-on-target method produced. The communication system that made all of this possible was equally deliberate. American artillery battalions were equipped with frequency-modulated radio sets rather than the amplitude-modulated sets used by most European armies. FM radio was largely immune to the static interference generated by vehicle ignition systems, a persistent problem that plagued German radio communications during mobile operations. The forward observers who called American missions carried man-portable SCR 300 radios with a practical voice range of roughly 3 to 5 miles. A single observer could, if necessary, talk directly to his battalion fire direction center, to an adjacent battalion, or to a division or corps coordinator, depending on the size of mission required. By the summer of 1944, the campaign in France had reached a condition neither side had anticipated. The Allied landings had succeeded, but the bocage, the ancient system of earthen banks and dense vegetation that divided Normandy into hundreds of small enclosed fields, had converted the entire theater into a series of natural fortifications. Every hedgerow was a ready-made defensive position. Every lane between them was a kill zone. Tanks were channeled into choke points where individual German soldiers with handheld anti-tank weapons could knock them out one at a time. The German commanders defending Normandy were skilled professionals operating in terrain that favored their doctrine. Rommel had spent months fortifying every approach, positioning his artillery, and stationing some of the finest remaining German divisions behind the Norman front. The 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army together committed more than 380,000 men to contain the Allied bridgehead. Yet, from the first days after the landing, something was going wrong that the German situation reports struggled to name. Formations moving to reinforce the front were being struck by fire from guns they could not see. Assembly areas selected precisely because they were hidden in woods and orchards became killing grounds within hours of units moving into them. Rommel put the problem plainly in his formal situation report, submitted on July 15, 1944. He wrote that the situation was growing more difficult daily and approaching a severe crisis. He cited specifically the enemy's enormous use of material, above all artillery, as the force responsible for losses so high that the fighting strength of divisions was rapidly diminishing. He documented that since the invasion, his forces had suffered approximately 97,000 casualties against only 10,000 replacement soldiers received, of which 6,000 had actually reached the front. He concluded that the enemy would succeed in breaking through the thin German front in the foreseeable future, and that the consequences would be beyond repair. 2 days after writing those words, a Spitfire strafed his staff car and put him out of the war. His assessment proved accurate, too, within a week. In the days before July 25th, Bayerlein had moved what remained of Panzer Lehr into defensive positions south of the Perrier-Saint-Lô road. 6 weeks of fighting had already taken a terrible toll. The division that had crossed into Normandy with over 200 armored vehicles was down to approximately 45 serviceable tanks and assault guns. The nearly 15,000 soldiers who had entered Normandy were now roughly 5,000, with perhaps 3,200 in forward defensive positions. The morning of July 25th began without incident. Slit trenches were dug to proper depth. Anti-tank guns were sighted in the hedgerows with cleared fields of fire. The soldiers in those positions were not raw recruits. They were men who had survived years of war, who recognized the sounds of incoming fire by caliber and distance, who had held against American attacks before. It was, in every observable respect, a morning identical to the dozens that had preceded it. What struck some observers as unusual was the silence from the American side, less harassing fire than usual in the night, fewer aircraft than usual in the early morning. Soldiers in a defensive line welcome quiet. At 0950 hours, the sound began. It came from the sky, not from the horizon where guns would announce themselves, but from directly above. A swelling mechanical roar that grew louder for minutes before the first bombs fell. The heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were arriving in streams, hundreds of them, releasing their loads in overlapping patterns across the strip of ground where Panzer Lehr held its defensive belt. Medium bombers followed. Fighter bombers came after those. The bombing lasted approximately 2 hours and 25 minutes and covered a rectangle of Norman farmland roughly 7 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep, the exact zone where Bayerlein's forward regiments were positioned. Approximately 4,000 tons of bombs were delivered onto that ground. But the bombers were not acting alone, and they were not the weapon that Bayerlein would remember most vividly. As the last waves of aircraft cleared the target area, more than 1,000 American artillery tubes opened fire simultaneously. Divisional and corps artillery from the 7th Corps and 8th Corps, 105 mm howitzers and 155 mm guns and heavier pieces at corps level, had been positioned and registered over the preceding days. Fire direction centers at battalion, division, and corps level had plotted every target and computed every firing data set. At a coordinated signal, every gun fired its first round. The shells arrived without the warning of a single ranging shot. There was simply the sound of the guns behind the American lines, and then the shells were already there, simultaneously from dozens of separate firing positions coordinated by mathematics and radio rather than proximity or direct observation. A single observer's radio call, a grid coordinate, and a type of target. The center computed the data for every tube in range, transmitted it in seconds, and confirm the time of fire. There was no upper limit to the number of battalions a skilled observer could mass on a single grid when the tactical situation demanded it. Within the first hour, the communications network of Panzer Lehr's forward positions collapsed entirely. Telephone lines severed by blast could not be repaired while the fires continued. Radio operators received nothing or received fragmented transmissions from men clearly in extremis. Runners sent forward from the command post reached the edge of the impact zone and could go no further. The command structure that linked Bayerlein to his regiments to their battalions, and battalions to their companies, ceased to function as an organized system in under an hour. Anti-tank gun crews were stunned in their positions by blast or killed by steel fragments that sliced through everything above ground level. Tank crews inside their vehicles were killed not by penetrating rounds, but by the concussive shock transmitted through the hull. Soldiers in properly dug slit trenches survived the bombs overhead, only to be killed by the artillery shells that arrived immediately after, fired at lower angles, and set to detonate on or near the surface. The systematic nature of the fires, covering the entire defensive belt without gaps, meant there was no safe direction to move. Moving forward put a man in front of the American infantry already advancing. Moving backward took him into reserve positions that were also under fire. Several men lost their minds. Bayerlein reported this without embellishment. Soldiers who had held their sanity through years of combat broke in those hours. They came out of their positions and ran in the open. They were killed by splinters before they reached anywhere. When the American infantry began its assault at 1100 hours, it did not encounter a defended line. It found a landscape that Bayerlein, in the single most quoted sentence of his testimony, described as a Mondlandschaft, a moonscape. Bomb and shell craters touched rim to rim across the entire defensive belt. The infantry units that had held that ground were gone as organized formations. Isolated individuals and small groups fought on in places. Others retreated in disorder. By early afternoon, the line that Panzer Lehr had been ordered to hold had been crossed. When a courier from Field Marshal von Kluge arrived demanding that the line be restored and asking whether his grenadiers, his pioneers, his anti-tank crews were holding their positions, Bayerlein gave the answer that has been preserved in the historical record ever since. He replied that they were holding their positions. They were still and mute, because they were dead. He estimated that more than 70% of the 3,200 men in his forward defensive belt had been killed, wounded, driven to madness, or so severely concussed they could no longer function as soldiers. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the men Germany had assembled from its finest institutional knowledge of armored warfare. Panzer grenadiers who had crossed continents, tank crews who had qualified on Germany's best vehicles, combat engineers who had built and cleared obstacles from Warsaw to Tripoli. The kind of men it had taken Germany years and multiple campaigns to produce, and that Germany in the summer of 1944 had no reserve of time or manpower to replace. Panzer Lehr was not an isolated case. Across the Normandy front, division after division reported the same pattern. Units that arrived at full strength were depleted within days. Experience could not be manufactured in any factory. Every morning the artillery took another portion of that irreplaceable knowledge with it into the ground. General Eberbach, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, acknowledged in his post-war interrogation that his artillery had been largely unable to respond effectively during critical phases of the fighting. His guns represented an inventory of captured weapons from across occupied Europe, French, Russian, Czech, Yugoslav, and Dutch pieces, with no shared fire direction system and batteries that could not mass their fires above the individual unit level without hours of pre-coordination. German Army records indicate that 5th Panzer Army's artillery fired approximately 10% of what the opposing British artillery fired against it. The same condition repeated at Mortain in August, when Hitler ordered 4 panzer divisions to cut the corridor to Avranches. On Hill 314 east of Mortain, roughly 700 surrounded American soldiers survived for nearly 6 days because 2 forward observer lieutenants with radios could call artillery from the hill onto every road and assembly area and axis of advance the Germans tried to use. The attack that should have reversed everything Cobra had achieved failed because the men and machines committed to it could not survive in ground covered by observers who could not be reached and silenced. By mid-August, 2 entire German armies were compressed into the Falaise pocket. When it closed, approximately 10,000 Germans were killed and 40 to 50,000 captured. In the northern sector alone, 344 tanks and assault guns and 2,447 vehicles were abandoned or destroyed. Eisenhower toured the ground and wrote that it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. After the war ended, the United States Army organized the collection of German officer testimony into a formal historical program. Approximately 2,500 foreign military studies written by captured or surrendered German officers were compiled and deposited at what is now the Combined Arms Research Library at Fort Leavenworth. They remain accessible to researchers today. What emerged from those interrogation rooms was a body of professional testimony that no Allied after-action report could have produced on its own, because it described the American system from the perspective of those who had been on the wrong side of it. Their defeat was instructive precisely because it was thorough. They had no incentive to minimize what had beaten them. Rommel cited artillery above all others in his final combat report. Von Kluge confirmed the same finding. Eberbach acknowledged the 10-to-1 disproportion in fire output. Every senior officer who put his name to the Foreign Studies record returned to the same point. The thing they had encountered in Normandy was not simply greater quantity. It was a method of using guns that their own army did not possess, a method that transformed the isolated battery into an instrument of mass destruction responsive to a single observer's voice. That method had been built not in response to an immediate crisis, but in the patient, unglamorous work of institutional development during years when no one was watching. The men at Fort Sill who worked through the 1930s on the Fire Direction Center were not generals. They were majors working with pencils and radio sets and field exercises, solving a problem that most senior officers had accepted as permanent because they had always seen it that way. The solution they produced was not a new weapon. It was a new way of thinking about how existing weapons could be connected to each other through communication and computation. It was a system, not a gun. The German army that faced that system at Caen and Saint-Lô and Mortain and Falaise had built its artillery around different assumptions, for planned concentrations against known targets, for the support of deliberate attacks against prepared positions. It had not built the communication architecture that would allow a single forward observer to become the director of an entire corps artillery group. When it encountered an army that had built all of those things and practiced them until they were reflexive, it had no ready answer. The men of the German artillery were not less skilled as individual gunners. Their equipment was not inferior in range or caliber, but skill and equipment at the battery level could not compensate for the absence of a system that operated above the battery level. War does not grade on individual components. It grades on how those components connect. What Fritz Bayerlein admitted to the American historians who interviewed him was not a complaint, and it was not an excuse. It was a professional reckoning. He had commanded an elite division. He had done what his training and his orders required. The ground had been prepared. The men had been positioned. Everything that the German system could do, it had done. And it had not been enough. The defeat at Cobra was not a failure of German courage or German tactical skill. It was the collision of a doctrine built for one kind of war with an opponent who had quietly, without announcement, built the tools for a different and more lethal kind of war altogether. The word he chose said everything about the war he had lost, and everything about the army that had beaten him. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit the like button. Subscribe to World War Declassified for new videos every week. Thank you for watching.